Good evening. Welcome again to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery of All Saints of North America. And I think we've got now about 305 videos online. We're quite pleased that we've been able to share that much with people. Some of the older videos, the sound, for whatever reason, seems to have gone on them. We probably won't try to remake those, although we may touch the subjects again later. There are 3 or 4 subjects that I've been asked to touch upon, and I'm going to discuss probably 3 of them this evening. I had promised to do a second video about collecting ourselves or gathering ourselves during prayer, and I've been asked a number of questions about it. So I'll later do a complete video just on that subject. One of the more pressing questions that I'm asked, though, is about conception control. And I would like to discuss that a little. It's a very touchy subject because people tend to have very strong feelings about it and sometimes mutually contradictory ideas even within the church. Last year when I was in Romania conducting a forum, a married priest asked me, in the midst of the forum itself, should we married priests continue our hypocrisy of telling people not to practice conception control while we ourselves are doing it? Well, I advise him to stop being hypocritical and just tell people outright, look, we do it. And, well, if you need to discuss it with your father confessor, do so. But really, the reason the married priest had been telling people not to practice conception control, even though many of the married priests were and are doing it themselves, is because they're afraid of being attacked perhaps by the monastics or something, or by some of the superstitions involved in it. Now, there are several methods of conception control, and one of them, of course, is condoms, which is also extremely useful in cutting back on communicable diseases. When I hear some of the reasons given in opposition to conception control, I think that's what I want to address, not conception control itself, but some of the often ludicrous reasons that are given for not practicing it. We can give reasons for and against, but some of the reasons given. In the Roman Catholic Church, the rhythm method of conception control is acceptable. This means that it's permissible to have sexual relations in a marriage without conceiving a child if you do it by natural means. That is, the so-called rhythm method. Now, having discussed this with a number of Roman Catholics and others who followed that advice, one comes to realize that when one is following the rhythm method, one spends a great deal more time thinking about sex than one would otherwise, because you're trying to plan and calculate when you can do it and when you can't, and all these other things. The rhythm method is conception control, pure and simple. So if it's acceptable, then let's try to find a reason why it's unacceptable if it's done by other means. Conception control, whether it's the rhythm method, coitus interruptus, or condoms, whatever. But the argument that conception control is a form of abortion is extremely peculiar. Now, I asked the person who held that view, what exactly do you mean? Supposing somebody has sexual relations and they use condoms, and we're talking about married couples now, of course, how is this tantamount to abortion? Well, because if you use condoms, the male sperm is going to be unused and die off. The female eggs are going to not be fertilized, and they're going to be wasted, they're going to die off. Now let's stop and think about that for a moment. because if we followed that line of reasoning to its ultimate conclusion, we would have to conclude that virginity is a sin, a form of abortion. Because when a woman is virgin, all of her eggs are going to pass out of her body and die unused. All of them. She's not going to stop menstruating because she's a virgin. And if a man remains totally virgin all of his life, when the tubules fill up, the sperm is going to be excreted, it's going to die off. Secondly, even if conception control is not practiced, man doesn't release a single sperm, but thousands of them. Only one of them actually fertilizes the egg. The rest die off. Aborted? Well, perhaps. So you see, the fallacy in the reasoning and the excuses given are part of the reason why, for the most part, the younger generation pay absolutely no attention to what's being said about the subject. So if you're going to argue against conception control, for heaven's sakes, do it with something that has a little veracity to it, something that is at least within the realm of reason, and something that's not completely false. That's part of the problem. So much of the arguing about why we should and shouldn't do things among Christians are ideological, and many of them are completely false and well outside the realm of truth and reason. So this question about conception control. Of course, many people, particularly monastics who have no, or are not supposed to be having sex and probably shouldn't think quite so much about other people's sex lives as they do. It'd be better if they tended to themselves and said their prayers. But in any case, that sex is essentially sinful, that marriage is, Augustine taught that marriage was a venial sin, and that marital life in general is essentially sinful. Well, there's something seriously wrong with this now. First of all, it means that God is the author of sin because he created male and female and gave them the means of procreation. Now, I realize that in the Manichaean system, there originated the story that Adam and Eve didn't have any sexual relations in Eden and wouldn't have, and that God would have provided another means of procreation without sex had man not fallen. There's no possible way to sustain such an argument. There's no possible way to make any kind of sense of it. Even to the point one monastic told me that Moses could never have been a great prophet if he had not been a eunuch, unable to have sex. Well, then when we asked, well, but Moses had a child. He produced a child, so he couldn't have been a eunuch unable to have sex. And the monk just looked a little confused and said, well, that's your tradition anyway. I'm not sure what tradition. Moses also had a beard, consequently he couldn't have been a eunuch. But anyway, this is one of the problems that we face in discussing these issues. Is we draw mythologies out, and we take a story that clearly originated in Manichaeism and promote it. Now, if God had intended for man to procreate in some way besides sexual relations, he most certainly could have provided for that regardless of the fall, and most certainly would have done so. He would not have created a situation in which his will could be contradicted and must be contradicted. If we accepted that procreation without sex was God's actual will, then of course we should canonize the inventors of in vitro fertilization because they have perfected a way to fulfill God's will, finally. So this neurotic attitude towards sex that has developed, particularly among some of our monastics, is very damaging, very harmful, and is really something that drives a wedge between people in Christianity because of the total irrationality and it's totally anti-scriptural. So that's what I want to say about conception control. I'll touch on this again later when I have more time. I'm out of time right now.